Go. Yeah. Pencil, I think, would work best.
Yeah, pencil will be fine.
Alright, I figured out how to use it. We're recording.
We're recording?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Alright, nervous system, brain. Alright, so this is on the intact, preserved brain. But you have, first off, you have your right and left cerebral hemisphere. Pretty straightforward. Right and left cerebral hemisphere. Next, you have your longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure is a long fissure that separates the left and the right cerebral hemisphere. It's pretty straightforward. Next, you have the lobes of the brain. You have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobes. Just like on the skull, they're in the same position. Next, you hit the sulci and the gyri. The sulci is just a generalized name for all of the grooves on the surface of the brain. So all of these grooves you see everywhere are all sulci. The gyri are just the bridges between the sulci. So pretty much the entire surface of the brain can be divided into either sulci or gyri. Next is the central sulcus. The central sulcus is a little difficult to see on this particular model, but if you see here, there's a sulcus that runs from the center, the longitudinal fissure here, all the way down to the side in a relatively straightforward manner. There's one, here's it over here, and here's this one over here. That's the central sulcus, and that acts as the dividing line between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Next, we have the lateral sulcus. Lateral sulcus is the dividing line between the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. On these brain models, it's really simple because where it separates is the lateral sulcus. So it just points it out to you already. Flip the brain over here. These brown lobes on the bottom of the brain are the cerebellum. If we remove these, you see this large rounded region right in here. This is the pons of the brainstem. So this is your pons. Going down towards the spinal cord, it's upside down, here is the medulla oblongata. And this turns into the spinal cord at the end. So it's your medulla oblongata. If you look in here, since we're still looking at an intact brain, this white surface right in here, this is the corpus callosum. And we'll look at that when we open up the brain in just a second. But this is how you can see it from an intact brain. And finally, we have the pituitary gland, which is just this little bean-like gland right here. And that's the pituitary gland. Next for the brain, we have to look at a sagittal section. This one. Put the cerebellum back on. Okay. Just like I just pointed out, the corpus callosum, which you can see from the bottom here, this whole ridge along here is the corpus callosum. And then next on here is the transverse fissure. The transverse fissure is relatively simple. It's just the dividing line between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. Next is the third and fourth ventricles. The ventricles are just air spaces within the brain. Therefore, it's really, you kind of look through them in these models. The third ventricle makes this shape right here. You can see the seahorse shape of the brainstem. The third ventricle is the seahorse's head. It's the airspace right in that area. The fourth ventricle is the airspace right here on the back of the pons where the cerebellum meets the pons. This is the fourth ventricle right here. Next is the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Up in the head of the seahorse again, this main region right here, remember the third ventricle is the airspace. Now we're looking at the actual wall, looking through the airspace. This wall right here is the thalamus, and it's the main portion of the seahorse's head. The hypothalamus is the seahorse's nose, right in this region. So thalamus, hypothalamus. The choroid plexus is a region of blood flow within the midbrain, and the choroid plexus on this particular model is this large blue structure. In other models is pink or other colors, but it always is in the position of the hair of the seahorse. Alright, next we have the pons. Pons we just looked at, it's the belly of the seahorse. The cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct is this groove that connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. So the cerebral aqueduct runs right up the spinal cord of the seahorse. Next is the cerebrum. Cerebrum is a term that we've been using, but I haven't properly defined it. The cerebrum is pretty much the brain mass. So if I just take apart the brain here, all the structure that's left is the cerebrum of the brain. Alright, something we already pointed out, I'm not sure why it's listed again, is the temporal lobe of the brain. The temporal lobe, of course, is just this portion of the brain right here, in the temporal region. Then you have the cerebellum again, which is just this brown lobe. Within the cerebellum, you can see this white branching structure. This white branching structure is the arbor vitae of the cerebellum. Arbor vitae means tree of life, and you can see how it looks like a tree. And the folia of the cerebellum, right here on the outer surface, you can see there's ridges running along the outer surface of the cerebellum, and those are the folia of the cerebellum. Next is the medulla oblongata. Remember, here's the pons, the stomach. The medulla oblongata is the tail of the seahorse. And then finally, the spinal cord is just the very tip of the tail.